Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to the Rustic Von Lodge, the fantastic kitchen of the Rustic Von Lodge, where it is very bright. It's very bright. I drew the shades, but it doesn't do much. I'm filming this late. It is 7:56 a.m. on Sunday morning here in California. Normally, I would have filmed this a few hours earlier, but I slept in a bit late today. So I'm filming this late and it'll go up a bit late. So there you go. But it is time for my weekend reading report where I talk about all the exciting things that I read during the previous week. And I read a few things. This week. So let's talk about those things. So I've got my list here for my 500 book challenge, the challenge where I have to read 500 books that I own before I will buy any new ones. I'm not going to be buying any new books for myself for a long time. But that's fine. I've got a ton of books to read. So, book number 142. Book number 142 on the challenge was this book. This is The Oakdale Affair by Edgar Rice Burroughs. The Oakdale Affair by Edgar Rice Burroughs, which I had always thought was a Western. I don't think I've ever read this. In fact, I know I never read this. I would have remembered. I always figured that this story was a Western, but it's not. It's not a Western. This was one of those books that when I was originally reading Edgar Rice Burroughs, I could never find a copy of it. But since those days of my teenagerhood, I did find a copy, and I finally read it because I'm reading all of the books by Edgar Rice Burroughs more or less in the order that he wrote them. And so this book is The Oakdale Affair, which is really wee. It's a tiny little book, and I should have, it's a shame I couldn't save it for Garbogust because it does have a cigarette ad in the middle, which is a trashy thing. The book itself wasn't that trashy, though, even though it's an Edgar Rice Burroughs book, and some people think Edgar Rice Burroughs is trash, but of course he's amazing and awesome. The book was decent. It was a decent story. Sometimes this is considered as being the third Mucker story in the Mucker series. It does have one of the main characters in the story is a character from the second book in the Mucker series, but otherwise it has no connection, really. I guess the best way to describe it would be to call it a crime story. It's kind of a crime story, but also kind of a comedy almost. It's not bad. It's decent. The cover on it actually gives away, it spoils one of the things that happens in the story. But the cover by Frank Frazetta, they got Frank Frazetta to do this cover, and there's like, what else are you going to put on this cover? There's literally nothing else that you could put on this cover except that bear. This bear, which features in this story. Like I said, it was a decent story. It was better than some of his other standalone kind of stories. It was not bad. Certainly not his best, but it was not bad. It was a decent story. And since it was so short, it moved along at a pretty good pace. There's everything in this story except the bear is pretty predictable. If you hadn't seen this cover, there would be one thing in this story which would be unpredictable or would have surprised you. But since you have this cover, it will not surprise you at all if you read this book. I will just say that. But it was a decent Edgar Rice Burroughs story. I'm glad I finally read it. Certainly not one of those must-read Edgar Rice Burroughs stories, but if you're intrigued by this author, it's good to read this. It was decent. This was number 142 on my list of 500 books. So there was that. Book 143 was a bit more interesting, and that was this book. This is Approaching Oblivion by Harlan Ellison, which is a Harlan Ellison book that I have never read. And so after I finished The Oakdale Affair, I was just kind of like, maybe I'll read one of my old science fiction books or something. And I saw this and I thought, you know what? I should read that. So I read Approaching Oblivion by Harlan Ellison. This is a collection of short stories that was put together in the 1970s. I want to say it was published in, well, let me look because I'll be wrong. It was published in 74. I would have been wrong. I was thinking it was a bit earlier. But it has stories from 1970, 1971, 1973, 1974. So early 70s stories by Harlan Ellison. The stories that Harlan Ellison wrote in the 1970s were a bit different than the stories that he wrote in the 1960s. They are, if anything, even more pessimistic. And this collection of stories it has a theme. It does have a unifying theme, even though the stories are all very different from each other. And the theme being, well, it says right here, road signs on the treadmill toward tomorrow, approaching oblivion. It's right there in your title, where he's worried about, these are stories concerned with the future and some worries that Harlan Ellison had about the future, his concerns about the future. And now that we are living in the future, if you compare it to this book, it's interesting to see the things that Harlan Ellison was concerned about. He was right to be concerned about all of the things that he's concerned about in this book. I mean, you have anxieties about America's democracy falling to become a right-wing tyranny, which is a valid concern. There's concerns about environmental catastrophe, alienation as always, how technology can advance to a point where human beings will be, kind of alienated from each other. And there's some just general weirdness in this collection. As far as the quality of the stories themselves, it's kind of a mixed bag. I do think this is not his best collection. I mean, some of these stories are, they're over the top Harlan Ellison. Harlan Ellison had a tendency to be kind of over the top, both in his personality and in his writing, although he was a great writer. But they can be a little too over the top. I'm particularly thinking of the first story in this book, which is called Knox, which is the story about America falling to become a tyranny, where democracy has been demolished. Racism is rampant. And racism is it's part of the new government. These are valid things to be worried about, of course, but the story itself was so over the top that it was a little like it. Harlan Ellison is not a subtle writer, and usually you don't want him to be, but he could have. It would have been more effective if it wasn't so over the top that it was ridiculous. And there's a little bit of that in some of these stories. Although some of the stories are really, really good. There's a story called Catman in this, which is just so weird that it's really interesting. There is a story that is kind of autobiographical in here called One Life Furnished in Early Poverty, which is a really good story, except it pretty much has the same plot as an old Twilight Zone episode. What was that episode called? Gareth would know. It was that episode from the first season, I think, of The Twilight Zone, where this burnt-out ad executive goes back to his hometown and somehow travels back in time and meets his younger self and his dad and stuff. It has the same plot, basically, as that story, only it's more bleak and pessimistic because, Harlan Ellison wrote it. So this is a good book. It's just not his best book. And there are some things about it that are a little, But it's good. It's just not great. It wouldn't be the book that I would hand to somebody and say, hey, this is Harlan Ellison, read this book. But, if you're really interested in Harlan Ellison, this is a good book to read because it does have some interesting stories in it, has some just really weird stuff in it, and it has a couple stories that aren't so great. So there's that. Approaching Oblivion by Harlan Ellison. Excuse me one moment. Sorry about that. Rhonda was doing something bad. My dog Rhonda likes to do bad things sometimes. So that was Approaching Oblivion. That was book number 143. Now, book 144 was probably the best thing I read all week. And that's this. This is Thor, War of the Pantheons. This is Thor Epic Collection Volume 16, which has Thor stories from 1987 through 1989. This collection, my dog's groaning over there. This collection of Thor stories, these are the Thor stories from the 1980s that happened right after Walt Simonson's fantastic, groundbreaking run on Thor. I am reading every issue of Thor from the early 1960s through the mid-90s, the first run of Thor. And this is the point that I was at, the stories that came right after Walt Simonson's run. And the stories that came right before Walt Simonson's take on Thor, those stories were not great. In fact, some of those stories were the worst Thor stories I think I had read since Thor first started in the early 60s. Some of the first Thor stories, Marvel didn't have a handle on that character yet, and some of those stories were just not so great. But then Thor became fantastic in the hands of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. But the stories that came right before Walt Simonson's run were pretty bad. And so I was worried that the stories that would come right after Walt Simonson's run wouldn't be all that great. And I had stopped reading Thor by the end of Walt Simonson's run, if I'm remembering right. So I did read like a couple of these stories when they first came out, but that was it. And then I kind of gave up the book, which was a mistake, as it turns out, because these stories are really, really good. These are some good issues. These issues were written by Tom DeFalco. Most of the artwork is by Ron Frenz. Ron Frenz is a really good writer, a really good artist. Ron Frenz is a really good artist. But he tends to strongly imitate other artists that he likes. And he does this deliberately and obviously, and that's very obvious in this volume. And in the early sections of this book, I mean, it's weird because he does have kind of a style of his own, so he doesn't really have to do that. So some of the early stories in this book, I remember reading this when it first came out. This is a one-shot story about a future version of Thor. Right after Walt Simonson's run, for some reason, we had this series of stories that took place at different times. One was, the first story in this volume is a story that took place in the middle of Secret Wars. So it was a past story of Thor. And then we have this story about a future version of Thor. There he is now. And the artistic style here is more reminiscent of John Buscema. It's kind of a mix, actually, of John and Sal Buscema. But it's good, And then we had this weird one-shot story about Thor fighting the Hulk, which is interesting because Eric Larson is doing the pencils, and he does not do a very good job. And Stan Lee does the script, which is interesting. And he does a decent job, except for the fact that there's really not much of a story here. The Thor and the Hulk fight, and that's pretty much the story. And Thor loses his temper, and that's it. That's the story. But then finally, in issue 386, we get some stories that take place chronologically after Thor's Walt Simonson run. So that's good. And I will talk more about those stories later this week. I will talk more about these on Wednesday, because I'm going to be doing an Epic Comic Book Wednesday all about War of the Pantheons, because there's just too much to talk about here than I can do right at the moment. So that was this. It wasn't the only Thor I read. I did read this annual. This is Thor Annual issue 13, or the 13th Thor Annual. This took place during Walt Simonson's run on Thor. We have a Walt Simonson cover here, which is fantastic. But I read recently the 12th annual, the 12th Thor annual, and that was okay. This is great. This is great. It has a script by Alan Zelenitz, but it has art by John Buscema. It has artwork by John Buscema. And John Buscema is just amazing here. He just is so fantastic. He's drawing Mephisto, which is basically Marvel's version of Satan. And he loves to draw this character. He loves it. You can tell. And we have Mephisto here, and he's walking on a bridge made of souls. It's so creepy. And he does a great job on this annual. And unfortunately, this annual, as far as I can tell, has never been reprinted. Has it? I don't think so. We get this great double-page spread of Ulik the Troll. It's fantastic. And basically, most of this issue is spent with, well, Mephisto being evil and being drawn gorgeously by John Buscema, and a battle between a world-weary Thor and Ulik. Thor is very depressed and doesn't want to fight or do anything else because his father just seemingly died. And so he just wants to be by himself, but no, he has to fight Ulik the Troll when he really, really would rather be doing other things. But they end up having a great fight with actually pretty serious consequences. And Thor goes to hell and faces Mephisto. And it's just great. This is why we need an epic collection collecting this era of Thor, because this issue needs to be reprinted. I mean, just look at that. That's amazing. That's just incredible stuff. So John Buscema, fantastic. This is great. The next thing I'm reading for Thor is In Mortal Flesh. This is the 17th epic collection of Thor. So I'm reading this right now. And so that was 144, War of the Pantheons. So what am I reading right now? Well, June just happened yesterday, so June on the Range is going on right at this very moment. And I am reading this book. This is Zorro, The Complete Pulp Adventures, Volume 1. This does count as a Western. It is also a book for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club, the cheapest book club around. All of the books that are available for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club are available for free on Project Gutenberg. And the book that is this month's book for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club is The Mark of Zorro, which is included in this volume. And I did finish The Mark of Zorro. And The Mark of Zorro is really good. It was the introduction of Zorro, written by Johnston McCulley. It was intended to be one single adventure starring this character. It was called originally The Curse of Capistrano, but the title was changed once the very popular Mark of Zorro movie was released. And at the end of the Mark of Zorro, Zorro, much like Tony Stark at the end of the first Iron Man movie, reveals his secret identity to the world. So, well, you can't have any more Zorro stories after that. Sure you can. Because Zorro proved so popular at the cinema that Johnston McCulley said, I got to write more Zorro stories. So he did, and he kept writing Zorro stories into the late 50s when he passed away. Kind of on and off, but he wrote a lot more Zorro and just ignored a lot of the events that happened towards the end of the first Zorro story. Like one of the villains dies, is killed by Zorro, that villain returns. Zorro's identity is secret in every story that follows, so that was ignored. It's possible, I suppose, it could be that the timeline of Zorro is just a little wonky, and that all of these are prequels, like every story that happens after the initial story is just a prequel. I don't know, I haven't gotten that far in the Zorro series. But certainly by the next story, which is Zorro Saves a Friend, and I believe every story afterwards, Zorro has a secret identity. And, it remains that way for the rest of the series. Also, Zorro was about to get married at the end of the first story. And I don't think that happens. And I don't think he's married for the rest of the series. Although, like I said, I haven't read those stories yet. I will, though, because I really enjoyed The Mark of Zorro. I thought it was tremendous fun. Very pulpy fun. Zorro is just unconquerable. I mean, you just can't beat this Zorro. He just gets away with everything, this guy. Some very far-fetched adventures of Zorro. But like I said, tremendous fun. It's very fun. And it does have some moments of real suspense. Particularly at the end, Zorro is put in a position where you're like, well, how's he going to get out of this? But he does through just, a remarkable thing that happens, which you will know if you read this story, The Mark of Zorro, otherwise known as The Curse of Capistrano, which you can get for free. But I have this volume, which is the first of the 6-volume set of Zorro, which is available from Bold Venture. I have to say, though, that this volume does have its share of typos. There are quite a few typos in this, I noticed. But I'm going to let it pass because it was such fun. I am still reading it because I do have to finish Zorro Saves a Friend and another short story, Zorro Hunts a Jackal. But I'll probably finish those up today, probably as soon as I'm done talking to you. And after I finish this, I'm continuing with June on the Range with Zane Grey. This is The Lost Wagon Train. The Lost Wagon Train. I'm betting it's about a lost wagon train. That's what I'm guessing that this book is about. Never read it. Zane Grey. Reading it for June on the Range. For June on the Range, the rules are simple. 4 weeks, so you can read a Zane Grey book, a Louis L'Amour book, and 2 books that are not by Zane Grey or Louis L'Amour. Easy rules, which you can feel free to break. You read any Westerns or just a Western, you've taken part in June on the Range. That's all you've got to do. Easy. But I'm reading this, The Lost Wagon Train by Zane Grey. So that's the next thing I'm going to read after I'm done with Zorro. The real Zorro that exists in real life is my dog Zorro, who is terrible. You know what happened last night? So at some point during the day yesterday, my dog Zorro, and I know it was Zorro, it wasn't anyone else. It wasn't Rhonda, Rhonda doesn't do this sort of thing. Zorro, at some point yesterday when I was not looking, jumped on the bed and peed on the bed and just soaked the bed with urine. Why did he do this since I take him for like 6 walks every day? I don't know. But I know it was Zorro because Zorro is the only one that would do such a terrible thing. I mean, he never does this at home, but he comes up here and he behaves mischievously. So I didn't know this, of course, until I got in the bed with dog pee and then had to get up and do laundry. So thanks, Zorro. Thank you. Mischievous character, Zorro. But that's it. I will shut up now. I will catch you next time. Zorro, why are you so bad? Why do you pee on the bed, naughty boy? That's very naughty.